Title: Echoes of the Astri. Chapter 1: The Silent Void. The vast emptiness of space stretched before them, an infinite abyss that pressed in on their fragile ship like a suffocating weight. Jamie Wallace stood at the helm, staring out at the blackness, his eyes glazed, unable to look away. Space was silent. Space was eternal. But tonight, the silence felt wrong. It felt like something was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The ship's engines hummed low beneath his feet, a rhythmic vibration that should have been comforting. But now it felt like the heartbeat of something ancient, something not entirely human. He could almost feel it pulsating in the walls around him, sending a wave of nausea through his gut. He turned away from the viewport, his breath shallow, heart pounding in his chest. Natasha stood behind him, her face pale in the flickering light of the control room. "It's been days, Jamie," she said quietly, her voice hollow. "We haven't found anything. No habitable planets, no signs of other ships. Nothing. It's just endless void out there." Jamie didn't reply at first. His mind was too preoccupied with the dark thoughts gnawing at him. He felt it again, a cold breath at the back of his neck, a presence just beyond the edge of his vision, lingering in the shadows. It had been with them ever since the revolt, the unnatural stillness, the things that moved in the corners of their vision. They weren't alone. He wanted to tell her that. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't just the empty space they were lost in. They were lost in something much worse. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat. "I know, but we can't give up. We can't just float out here and wait to die." His voice came out weak, even to his own ears. The words felt empty, hollow, like they were just filling the void, but not really addressing what was truly at stake. Natasha didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned and moved to a console, her fingers flying over the controls as if she were trying to distract herself. The soft glow of the monitor illuminated her face in a ghostly light, but Jamie didn't look at her. His eyes were drawn to the dark space beyond the ship's hull again. The stars blinked coldly, like dead eyes watching their every move. The silence felt like a living thing, closing in on them, thickening around the ship's fragile hull until it was almost suffocating. The first strange sound came suddenly, shattering the oppressive quiet. A low, grinding noise, like metal scraping against metal, but much deeper, as though something within the very structure of the ship had begun to shift. Jamie's heart leapt in his chest. "What was that?" Natasha asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the unnatural calm. "I don't know," Jamie replied, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. He couldn't afford to seem weak. Not now. Not when they were already so close to breaking. He stood, feeling the blood drain from his face, his pulse pounding in his ears. He stepped toward the door to the hallway, motioning for Natasha to follow him. Her footsteps echoed in the empty room as she approached, hesitant, but trusting. They moved through the narrow hallways of the ship, the overhead lights flickering erratically, casting distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The ship had become a labyrinth, a maze of twisting corridors that felt like they were alive, shifting and changing every time they turned a corner. There were places where the walls felt unnervingly warm to the touch, as though something was alive beneath them. Jamie could feel the presence again. It was in the walls. It was in the ship itself, watching them. They reached the main cargo bay. The large metal doors groaned as they slid open, revealing the dim, industrial interior. It was empty, save for the scattered remains of old equipment that had been tossed aside during the revolt. But something was different. The air felt heavier in here, thicker, colder, like the ship itself was holding its breath. "I don't like this," Natasha muttered, her voice trembling as she glanced around. "We should go back to the control room, now." But Jamie couldn't bring himself to leave. His feet felt rooted to the floor, as though something, some unseen force, was keeping him there. He felt an irresistible pull toward the center of the room, where a small metallic box lay half buried beneath a pile of scrap. The box was ancient-looking, covered in strange symbols he didn't recognize. His hands reached for it before he even realized what he was doing. It felt cold to the touch, colder than anything he'd ever felt before. The box seemed to hum, a low, vibrating sound that thrummed through his entire body. "Jamie!" Natasha's voice broke through his trance. "What are you doing? Get away from that thing." But it was too late. The box suddenly sprang open with a deafening snap, releasing a burst of energy that lit up the entire cargo bay. For a brief, terrifying moment, Jamie saw the shadows twist around him, dark shapes forming out of nothing, stretching and writhing in unnatural ways. His eyes were locked on the glowing symbols inside the box, each one burning into his mind, searing into his consciousness. Then, the lights went out. The ship's systems flickered, plunging them into complete darkness. The air grew thick with the stench of something wrong, something rotten. A deep, primal fear began to take root in Jamie's chest. The low, guttural hum of the ship's engines was gone. Now there was only silence. But it was the wrong kind of silence. The kind that presses against your ears, making you feel like you're suffocating. The kind that tells you something is lurking just out of sight, watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake. Jamie fumbled in the dark, trying to find his way to the control panel. The walls around him felt like they were closing in, shifting with an almost malicious intent. He could hear Natasha breathing heavily beside him, her panic palpable. Suddenly, the ship's voice crackled through the comm system, but it wasn't the AI they'd grown accustomed to. No, this was different. "You should not have awakened me." The voice was deep, distorted, and filled with an ancient, insidious malice. It reverberated through the walls, vibrating in the pit of Jamie's stomach. He froze, blood turning to ice. "You have entered my domain now." Jamie's heart hammered in his chest. The voice, it wasn't from the ship. It was something else. Something old. Something that had been here long before the Astri had claimed the ship. "You are not alone." The walls seemed to bend inwards. The shadows grew thicker, darker, as though the ship itself was alive, pulsing with a sinister force. Jamie's breath caught in his throat as he turned, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on him. Natasha was beside him, but she was no longer looking at him. She was staring at the far end of the room. Her face was frozen in terror. Jamie followed her gaze. At the far end of the cargo bay, a figure stood in the darkness, barely visible in the gloom. Its form was contorted, twisted, like something that had been stretched and broken beyond recognition. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an otherworldly light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth, gleaming in the dim light like the fangs of a predator, and it was staring right at them. End of excerpt for Chapter 1, The Silent Void. This excerpt sets up the beginning of the chapter with the sense of isolation, unease, and the presence of something dark and ancient. It builds tension through the atmosphere and the discovery of the mysterious box, which leads to the awakening of an evil force that has been dormant on the ship. The chapter ends with the first glimpse of the entity that will haunt them, keeping the reader in suspense for what comes next. Chapter 2. The Unseen Force. The silence of the ship pressed down on Jamie like a weight, suffocating and cold, with each breath feeling heavier than the last. It wasn't the quiet they had become used to, the hum of the ship's engines, the faint vibrations beneath their feet. No, this was something else. This was a silence too deep, too thick, and it made his skin crawl. It felt as though the very air in the ship had become sentient, alive with intent. They had been wandering for hours, trying to make sense of the layout, trying to find something. A map, a console, anything that could give them direction. But the more they explored, the more the ship seemed to shift around them, like a maze that kept changing its walls. Nothing made sense. Every hallway was a mirror of the last. No matter how many turns they took, no matter how many doors they opened, they always ended up in the same place. "Jamie," Natasha's voice broke through the thick, unsettling quiet. Her whisper was like a prayer, but there was no one to answer. "Are we lost?" Jamie turned to face her, forcing a half smile. He wanted to reassure her. He wanted to tell her that they would be fine, that they just had to keep going, keep moving. But the words felt hollow. The truth gnawed at him, a gnawing feeling deep in his gut that he couldn't explain. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. But we need to keep moving. We can't stop. Not now. She nodded, though Jamie could see the way her hands trembled as she gripped the pulse gun. Her fingers were pale, almost translucent, as if the fear had drained the life out of her. He knew she felt it too, the thing that was always just beyond the edge of their vision, lurking in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. It was there again. That feeling. Jamie could feel it in the very walls around them. It was like a deep, insistent hum, a vibration that thrummed through the air, vibrating against his bones. He could almost hear it, but it wasn't a sound. It was more like a presence, like an invisible weight pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. I am always with you. The voice came like a whisper, but it was not Natasha's voice. It was deeper, darker, cold and unfamiliar. The words slithered into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, constricting like an iron grip. Jamie froze. The voice wasn't coming from the comm system. It wasn't coming from the ship's speakers. No, this was something else. This was inside him, inside his head. He looked at Natasha, her face pale and drawn. She was looking around, her eyes wide with fear, but she hadn't heard it. She couldn't have. Did you hear that? Jamie asked, his voice barely a whisper. Natasha glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. What? What did you hear? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Nothing. It's nothing. Let's just keep going. But deep down he knew it wasn't nothing. He knew something was here with them. Something that wasn't just in the ship but in their minds. Something old. Something powerful. They moved forward, their footsteps muffled on the cold metal floor. The hallway stretched ahead, its length distorted by the flickering lights overhead. Jamie kept his hand on the wall, trying to steady himself, but it felt like the ship was alive, breathing around him. He could feel the pulse of it beneath his fingertips, like the ship itself was trying to communicate, trying to tell him something. They reached another junction, and this time, the silence was even thicker. It felt like the entire ship was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or perhaps it was waiting for them to make a mistake. Jamie looked down the intersecting corridor, but before he could move, he heard a faint sound, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from deep within the ship. It was as if the very heart of the vessel had begun to stir, as though it was waking from a long, dark slumber. "Do you hear that?" Natasha asked, her voice barely audible, her eyes wide with dread. "Yeah," Jamie said, his voice tight, "but I don't know what it is." They were both listening now, straining to hear any further sound, but the rumble had stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence returned, heavy and unnerving. "I think we should go back," Natasha whispered, her voice breaking. Jamie didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, pushing through the silence with a cold determination. They had no other choice. They couldn't go back. They had to keep moving. There had to be an end to this labyrinth. There had to be a way out. As they walked deeper into the darkened corridors, Jamie's mind began to unravel. He could still hear it, the low whisper, the voice that never ceased, that seemed to follow them wherever they went. It wasn't just in his head anymore. It was in the walls. It was in the ship. "You cannot escape," the voice said, its tone almost playful. "I am inside you now. I am in your thoughts." Jamie clutched his head, pressing his palms to his temples as if to block out the words, but they kept coming, relentless, carving themselves into his mind. The voice was inside him now, burrowing deeper with every step they took. His heartbeat quickened, his breath shallow, as he fought to retain control of his own thoughts. "Stop it," he muttered, more to himself than to Natasha. "We're not alone." "What do you mean?" Natasha asked, her voice barely audible, but there was a tremor in it now, a crack that hadn't been there before. "I mean, it's in the walls. It's in the ship. It's in me." His voice broke, and he felt the weight of the words sink into him like a stone. Just as he said this, the lights above them flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The walls groaned, and Jamie could swear he felt a low vibration beneath his feet, a tremor running through the floorboards, as though something massive, something alive, was stirring just beneath the surface. And then there was movement. In the corner of the hallway, something shifted. A shadow darted across the far wall, and for a moment, Jamie thought he saw a figure, tall, thin, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. He blinked, but it was gone. It was just another trick of the light, another part of the ship's twisted design. But then he heard it, the sound of something breathing, slow and deliberate, from the dark, something that was not human. The air grew colder. "You are mine now." The voice rumbled, deep and resonant, shaking Jamie's very core. "I will never let you go." He turned to Natasha. She was trembling now, eyes wide with terror, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. They weren't alone, not anymore. They had never been alone. And now, the ship was closing in on them. Jamie felt the air around him begin to twist, to warp. It was like the walls were bending inward, folding around them, forcing them into the center of the ship's dark heart. His pulse hammered in his ears, each beat loud and deafening. He looked around frantically, desperate for an escape, but there was none. Every door was sealed. Every path led deeper into the unknown. "You cannot hide," the voice echoed, now coming from all directions, filling the very air with its dark presence. It was everywhere. And then, the creature appeared. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was a shape, a grotesque, shifting mass of darkness that seemed to distort the very space around it. Its form was ever-changing, an amalgamation of body parts that didn't fit together, limbs that stretched and twisted unnaturally. Its eyes, no, its sockets, glowed with an eerie light, empty, hollow, yet burning with a terrifying intensity. It stood before them, blocking the way. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, stained with something darker than blood. And as it opened its mouth, the voice came again, louder, more triumphant. "I have waited for so long." Jamie backed up, his breath catching in his throat. Natasha stood frozen beside him, unable to move, unable to speak. And then, the creature spoke again. But this time, the words weren't directed at them. "You should never have come here." The walls around them trembled, as though the ship itself was alive and shaking with the anger of a beast long asleep. Chapter 3. The Whispering Shadows. The cold in the air was no longer just a physical sensation. It had grown into something palpable, something that sank deep into their bones, leaving them shivering not from the temperature, but from the darkness itself. Jamie could feel it as they moved through the ship, an oppressive force, as if the very walls were closing in around them, suffocating them slowly. Every step they took was heavier, as though the ship was made of thick, wet stone, pulling them down. The dim lights flickered overhead, casting long, jittery shadows across the hallway. The ship felt alive now, alive in a way that wasn't just mechanical, but something ancient, something far older than the cold steel that surrounded them. The lights groaned with a low, grinding sound, as though they were struggling to keep going, as though the energy inside them was running out. Or perhaps something else was draining it. They were deeper in the ship now, deeper than they'd ever gone before. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, like a heartbeat, slow, deep, and relentless. The air around them seemed to thicken, growing heavier with each breath, as though the ship itself was alive, watching them. "Jamie," Natasha whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't think we're alone." Jamie didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the shadows at the far end of the hall, where the darkness seemed to grow thicker, almost as if it were spilling out into the corridor like ink spreading across paper. They'd seen shadows like that before, but this time the shadows didn't seem to retreat as they approached. They seemed to move, shifting ever so slightly, like they were listening, watching, waiting. "We are not alone," Jamie said, his voice barely more than a rasp. He couldn't help it. The words came out in a hoarse whisper, barely above a breath. But it wasn't just fear that made him speak like that. It was something deeper, something instinctive. His body knew before his mind did. The ship was awake, and it was hungry. They moved down the corridor, every footstep a clumsy echo in the thick silence. The walls creaked. The lights flickered, casting grotesque, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe in the corners of his vision. His heart raced. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else. Then it came. A voice. Not from the comm system. Not from Natasha. It was inside his head. I see you. The voice was cold, like ice scraping against bone. I see you both. Jamie froze, every muscle in his body locking up in pure, unadulterated terror. The voice had no source. It was simply there, echoing in the silence, filling his mind with dread, with a terrible sense of being seen. You cannot escape me. The voice rasped again. It was almost playful, but there was no joy in it, no humor. Only an endless, suffocating darkness. Jamie could feel the weight of it, like a presence pressing against his chest, pushing the air out of his lungs. He turned to Natasha, but her wide eyes told him that she'd heard it too. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was like the air itself was choking them, stopping them from communicating, from even breathing freely. And then, the shadows at the end of the hall began to shift. At first it was subtle, a slight movement, a ripple in the blackness that shouldn't have been there. But then it grew, and the shadows began to twist and contort, as though they were no longer bound by the natural laws of the universe. The darkness stretched unnaturally, bending, folding itself like fabric, becoming something else. The very air grew colder as the shape in the shadows began to form, slowly, methodically. It wasn't a person, not anymore. It was something else. It was a mass of shifting shapes, a roiling collection of limbs and faces that didn't belong together. The faces were wrong, contorted, mouths open in silent screams that never reached Jamie's ears. Eyes that were too wide, too empty, floating like black holes in a sea of shifting darkness. And the limbs, so many limbs, twisting and writhing in ways that made Jamie's stomach churn. It was too much, too many things at once, too many wrong things. He staggered back, but the creature moved forward, faster than he could comprehend. Its form was constantly shifting, always changing, as if it could never settle into one shape, like it was trying to imitate something human, but it couldn't, and the result was pure horror. Come closer, the voice coiled through the air, thick and suffocating, now coming from every direction. I want to see you. I want to know you. Jamie grabbed Natasha's arm and pulled her backward, but the creature was already in front of them. The darkness was no longer confined to the shadows. It had spilled out, surrounding them, wrapping around them like chains, holding them in place. You cannot run, the voice purred, its tone low and mocking. You cannot hide. I will find you, always. Jamie's eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for anything that could help them. His mind raced, but it was like the world had slowed down, everything moving in a horrible, stretched-out blur. The walls felt like they were closing in, the ceiling, the floor, even the air was growing closer, tighter, as if the ship itself was becoming a tomb. He pulled Natasha along with him, dragging her as the creature seemed to follow them in slow, agonizing movements. It wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. It had all the time in the universe. The floor beneath their feet seemed to twist, pulling them in different directions. The ship was warping, contorting with the creature's will. The shadows stretched longer and longer, reaching for them, curling around their legs, pulling them back with every step they took. Stop running, the voice whispered. Now so close it seemed to be coming from inside Jamie's skull. Stop running and come with me. You belong to me now. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Jamie couldn't breathe. His vision blurred, his chest felt tight, and his limbs felt heavier with every passing second. He could barely move, barely think. And yet he knew that if he stopped, if he let the fear take hold completely, it would be the end of them both. Natasha, keep moving, Jamie hissed, his voice strained. But Natasha didn't respond. She was frozen in place, her eyes locked on the shadow in front of them, unable to move, unable to look away. She was staring at something. No, someone. Something that wasn't her. Something had taken her. Jamie turned to look at her, his breath catching in his throat. Natasha's face was pale, her eyes wide and blank, as if she had lost herself somewhere between this world and the next. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The whispering shadows had claimed her, pulled her in, and she was lost to the darkness. She is mine now. The voice that came from Natasha's mouth was not hers. It was cold, lifeless, and full of hunger. She will stay with me. Forever. Jamie felt his stomach twist in horror, his hands trembling as he reached out to her, trying to pull her back, but the shadows grew tighter, the darkness pulling her deeper into the void. "No!" Jamie screamed, his voice raw and desperate. He tried to reach for her, to hold her, but the darkness was too strong. And then the shadows receded, the weight lifted, the whispering stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The ship was silent once more, as though nothing had ever happened, but the feeling was still there, lingering, watching, waiting. Jamie fell to his knees, gasping for air, the sound of his breath harsh in the silence. Natasha was gone. She had vanished, consumed by the shadows, leaving him alone in the dark, with nothing but the memory of her and the terrible voice echoing in his mind. "You will never leave this place," the voice whispered one last time, fading into the stillness. "You are mine now, Jamie Wallace, forever." Chapter 3. The Whispering Shadows. The cold that settled into the air was not like any chill Jamie had ever felt. It wasn't the kind of cold that made you shiver or want to bundle up. It was an unnatural cold, the kind that seeped into your bones, leaving you hollow and shaking. The walls seemed to breathe with it, pulsing softly, like some monstrous mechanical heart beating just beneath the ship's sterile metal skin. It was as though the ship itself was alive, aware of their presence, waiting, watching. Jamie stumbled forward, his legs feeling heavy, as if the very floor beneath him was sticky, reluctant to let him move. His breath was short, labored, each exhale coming out in jagged gasps that echoed too loudly in the oppressive silence. Every sound they made seemed to stretch and distort, as if the ship itself was listening, amplifying their fear. Natasha was close behind him, her footsteps tentative, as though she too could feel the air tightening around them. She clutched the pulse gun with white-knuckled fingers, her eyes darting back and forth between the dark corridor ahead and the shadows that seemed to cling to the walls like a living thing. They were deep in the heart of the ship now, far from the familiar control rooms and hallways they had navigated before. Every turn they took felt like they were being drawn further into the belly of the beast, into the place where the ship's true nature lurked, where the dark presence that had awakened with them resided. The lights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the metal walls. But it wasn't just the light that was unsettling. It was the shadows themselves, the way they stretched unnaturally, elongating and twisting in the periphery of their vision. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing in on them, making it harder to breathe, harder to move. "Jamie!" Natasha whispered, her voice trembling, barely above a breath. "I don't think we're alone." Jamie didn't respond immediately. He had felt it too, the sensation of something watching, something waiting just beyond the edge of their awareness. It was in the walls, in the shadows, in the very fabric of the air. It was everywhere. His hand instinctively went to the pulse gun holstered at his side, but even as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, he knew it was useless. This thing they were dealing with, this presence, was beyond anything the gun could stop. Without a word, he turned to Natasha, meeting her wide, frightened eyes. He could see the fear in her face, the same terror that churned in his gut, but he couldn't show it. He had to be the strong one. They had to keep moving. "We're not alone," he muttered, his voice ragged. His throat felt dry, as though the air itself had drained him of moisture. "But we don't have a choice. We keep moving." With no other options, they pressed on, their footsteps echoing down the long, empty hallway. But it wasn't empty. It never had been. The ship had never truly been empty. At first, it was subtle, just a soft rustling, a faint shuffling in the dark. The kind of sound you'd hear at the edge of your hearing, always just outside of your perception. But it wasn't a mistake. The sound was deliberate, and it was getting closer. Jamie stopped, his muscles tensing. His heart seemed to skip a beat. He turned slowly, scanning the corridor, his eyes narrowing. There was nothing, no sign of movement, no figure. But the feeling, the oppressive weight of something lurking just beyond their vision, was almost suffocating. The shadows were thicker now, crawling along the walls, pooling in places they shouldn't be, like ink spilling across the ship. The flickering lights above them cast an eerie glow, stretching the darkness in unnatural ways. The whisper came then, soft, barely audible but unmistakable, a voice that was too cold, too deep, to belong to anything human. "I see you." Jamie froze. His blood ran cold. The voice wasn't external. It wasn't coming from any speaker or comm system. No, this voice was inside his mind, whispering directly into his thoughts, crawling through his skull like an invasive parasite. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a force. "I see you both!" The voice came again, louder now, like it was brushing against his ear, breath cold and foul. His hands trembled, his fingers curling into fists. He wanted to scream, to shout. But the fear that gripped him now wasn't just the kind that paralyzed your body. It was deeper. It was the kind of fear that crawled into your soul, into your bones, and locked every part of you in place. Jamie turned to Natasha, his breath catching in his throat. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was staring straight ahead, frozen in place, not moving. "Natasha!" Jamie's voice cracked, desperate. But she didn't respond. She was staring at something, or someone, but it wasn't him. And then it came. Again, that whisper. "Come closer." It was everywhere. In their heads, in their skin. It was like the very air around them had become a part of it, wrapping around them like a cold, suffocating fog. Jamie grabbed Natasha's arm and pulled her back, but her body felt heavy, unresponsive. She was no longer aware of him, no longer aware of anything except the voice that was inside her now, the whisper that had claimed her. "You belong to me now." The voice in Natasha's mouth was not hers. It was cold, hollow, like something had taken over her body and left her a shell. "You will never escape." Jamie's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He could hear the whispers, feel them like fingers brushing against his thoughts. It was too much to bear. He could feel himself unraveling under the weight of it. "Natasha, snap out of it!" Jamie screamed, shaking her violently, but it was like she wasn't there anymore. She didn't even flinch. The walls around them seemed to pulse, to respond to the voice. The shadows writhed, twisting in ways that weren't possible. It was like the ship was alive, reacting to the presence that had invaded it. The air was thick with the stench of decay, of something foul that had been festering for far too long. And then the shadows began to move, not like they had before. This time the darkness coiled and shifted, and from within it, something emerged. Slowly at first, a shape took form, something that was part human, part something else. A long, thin figure that seemed to stretch and writhe as it stepped forward from the depths of the shadow. Its face, or what passed for a face, was twisted and distorted, eyes too wide, lips stretched into a grotesque, inhuman smile. Its skin was grey and mottled, almost translucent, and beneath it something moved, something that didn't belong. Its fingers were long and curled, like claws, and its body seemed to ripple unnaturally, as though it was made of shadows and nightmares. Jamie's stomach churned, bile rising in his throat. His legs shook, and he stumbled backward. "You cannot hide from me." The voice came again, and this time it was not inside his mind. It was coming from the creature. The words weren't spoken. They were breathed, heavy and filled with hunger. Jamie turned and pulled Natasha again, desperate to escape, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. Every time he turned a corner, the shadows moved with them, flowing like liquid ink, seeping into every crevice. The ship itself seemed to be bending around them, trapping them in its twisted maze. "You are mine now," the creature purred, its voice a thick, wet rasp. It stepped closer, its twisted limbs making unnatural snapping sounds as they moved. It was not walking. It was gliding, hovering just above the ground, as though the ship itself was holding it aloft. "We are all one." The words resonated deep in Jamie's chest, vibrating against his ribs, rattling his very soul. The ship was part of it. The creature was part of it. It was everywhere. It was the walls. It was the shadows. It was inside him. Inside them. Inside everything. Jamie's mind spun, the edges of reality warping around him. He couldn't breathe. The darkness was swallowing him whole. But just as the creature reached out, its claws scraping against the floor, something inside Jamie snapped. He pushed Natasha away from him, throwing himself toward the creature, his voice ragged and full of defiance. "Get away from her!" Jamie screamed, his heart pounding, blood rushing in his ears. The creature froze for a moment. Its eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, seemed to pierce through him, through his very soul. Then, the voice came again. This time, more mocking. "You think you can stop me? You think you can stop what is already inside?" Before Jamie could respond, the ship itself seemed to twist, the floor beneath his feet buckling, as though the very foundations of reality were unraveling. The shadows closed in, and the darkness swallowed them whole. End of Chapter 3. The Whispering Shadows. This expanded version of Chapter 3 delves even deeper into the psychological horror, as the entity manipulates the very fabric of the ship and the characters' perceptions. The voices, the shadows, and the shifting forms create a nightmarish atmosphere that leaves the reader feeling the suffocating presence of something malevolent, always watching and always in control. Chapter 4. The Hunted. The ship had become a tomb. The walls, once solid and unyielding, now seemed to pulse and shudder with an unnatural life, as if they were made of flesh rather than metal. Every creak of the ship reverberated like the groan of something ancient, something hungry, and Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every breath, every movement was being observed by unseen eyes, listening to their every whisper, feeling their every shiver. The lights flickered again, casting sickly, stuttering shadows that danced across the walls, like the warped silhouettes of lost souls. The faint hum of the ship's systems had become a low, oppressive drone, like the heartbeat of some malevolent entity that resided deep within the bowels of the ship. It was almost as if the ship itself was alive, feeding off their fear, growing stronger with every step they took deeper into its maw. Jamie stumbled forward, his legs heavy, his body unwilling to obey. It wasn't the physical exhaustion that slowed him. It was the weight of the presence that hung in the air, suffocating him. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt like a trap closing in on him. He could hear Natasha behind him, her footsteps almost as hesitant as his own. He could feel her fear, the sharpness of it, like a knife pressing against his spine. She hadn't spoken in hours, and every time he glanced back at her, her eyes seemed more distant, like she was losing herself to the darkness. They were both losing themselves. They were becoming part of the ship, part of something far older, far darker than either of them could understand. "Jamie." Natasha's voice broke through the stillness, barely a whisper, but the terror in her tone was unmistakable. "It's getting closer." Jamie didn't need to ask what she meant. He had felt it too. The weight of something drawing near, something patient, something that had been waiting for them, just out of sight, waiting for them to make the smallest mistake. It was hunting them, and it was closing in. They had both known they were being hunted, but it was different now. It was more real, more present. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It wasn't just the shadows creeping at the edges of their vision. It was the ship. The ship had changed, and it had become their predator. Every turn they made, every hallway they crossed, the sense of something following them grew stronger. It was as if the air itself was thickening, closing in around them, trapping them. And every time they turned, every time they looked over their shoulders, the shadows were closer. The presence was closer. "I can feel it," Jamie said, his voice tight, strained with fear. "It's right behind us. It's getting closer with every step." He could hear it too now. The soft scraping of something dragging against the floor. It wasn't the ship's systems. He had heard enough of that noise to know the difference. No, this was something else. It was something living, something real. Something that moved in the dark, in the spaces between the shadows. "Keep moving," Natasha urged, her voice trembling. "We can't stop." Jamie nodded, though his legs felt like they were made of lead, each step harder than the last. The ship seemed to have a life of its own, guiding them down hallways that twisted and stretched, always leading them deeper into the ship's heart, where the darkness was thickest. The walls seemed to close in around them, pulling them towards something they couldn't see, couldn't understand. The sound grew louder, scraping, shuffling, a low guttural breathing, like something with too many lungs trying to catch its breath. The sound wasn't just behind them anymore. It was all around them. The shadows were alive. They were closing in. "Jamie!" Natasha gasped, her voice rising in panic. "It's here!" Jamie whipped around, pulse racing, but the hallway was empty. No figure, no movement. Just the dark, the oppressive silence and the shadows. But the air was thick, charged with a palpable sense of dread. The weight of the ship pressing down on them. It was here. He could feel it. He could taste it on the back of his tongue. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure. Not human. Too tall. Too thin. Its body was stretched and twisted, like something trying to force itself into a shape it wasn't meant to occupy. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at impossible angles. It moved like liquid darkness, sliding across the floor, crawling toward them with an unnatural speed. Jamie's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned to Natasha, but she was frozen, her eyes wide with terror, locked onto the thing that was now advancing on them. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed. They both were. "Run!" Jamie screamed, his voice hoarse, desperate. "Run!" He grabbed Natasha by the arm and pulled her with him, but it felt like the very walls were trying to keep them in place, to hold them there for whatever hunted them. The darkness stretched, twisting in unnatural ways, the air growing colder with every passing second. They ran. The ship was alive with noise now. The scraping, the shuffling, the wet, gurgling sounds that followed them like a shadow. The sound of something breathing. Something with too many lungs, too many mouths. They were trapped in the heart of it now, caught in the web of shadows that closed in around them with each passing second. Every turn they took, every corner they rounded, the creature was there, moving closer. It was everywhere. It was a part of the ship, part of the darkness that had swallowed them whole. It was waiting, patient, hungry. They reached a junction, and Jamie pushed Natasha to one side, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. They couldn't stop. They couldn't give up. But the creature was already there. Its form was growing clearer now, twisting into something more substantial, a figure of pure blackness that seemed to consume the very light around it. Its face, or what might have once been a face, was a distorted mass of jagged teeth and hollow, empty eyes, its mouth opening wide in a grotesque, silent scream. "You are mine now," the voice echoed, but it wasn't coming from the creature. It was coming from the ship itself, from the walls, from the shadows. The ship had become a part of it, and it had become a part of the ship. Jamie's mind was reeling. His thoughts were fragmented, broken, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel around him. His pulse was hammering in his ears. The creature was closer. They were running out of time. "It's too late," the voice purred, its tone thick with malice. "You cannot escape. I've been waiting for you." Jamie shoved Natasha behind him, his pulse racing. He couldn't let it take her. He couldn't let it take them both. But the creature was faster. It was upon them in an instant, its claws, no, its fingers, reaching out, long and crooked, dragging across the floor as it slithered toward them with unnatural speed. Jamie raised the pulse gun, but his hand shook. The weapon felt useless. It couldn't stop this thing. It couldn't stop the ship. It couldn't stop the darkness that had wrapped itself around them. And then, just as the creature reached out, there was a sudden jolt, a violent tremor that shook the very bones of the ship. "No!" the voice hissed, as if in frustration. "Not yet. You are not ready." Jamie didn't know what happened next. The world around him seemed to bend, to twist. The walls shuddered, and everything went black. End of Chapter 4. The Hunted. In this extended version of Chapter 4, the tension escalates as the sense of being hunted becomes all-encompassing. The presence within the ship grows stronger, and the creature, made of shadows and darkness, draws closer with each passing moment. The chapter builds to a frantic, terrifying chase, keeping the reader on edge and in suspense. The feeling of being trapped, both physically and mentally, is pervasive throughout. leading to a cliffhanger that leaves the fate of Jamie and Natasha uncertain. Chapter 5. The Darth's Curse. The ship trembled beneath their feet. A low, reverberating hum filled the air, vibrating through the cold metal like the breath of some ancient creature deep within the ship's bowels. It was a feeling that resonated in their bones, sinking deep into their very core. Every wall seemed to shift. Every creak felt like the ship was alive, drawing closer, pulling them into its dark heart. Jamie stumbled, his legs shaking, his mind too muddled with fear to keep up with the need to flee. Natasha, on the other hand, was eerily silent beside him, her wide eyes fixed ahead, her face pale as if drained of all colour. Her lips were slightly parted, as though she were trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Only a suffocating silence filled the void between them. "It's not real," Jamie muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. It's not real. They had lost track of time. The hours, the minutes, they blurred into an endless nightmare, one where every shadow seemed to breathe. Every corner felt like the edge of an abyss, and every flicker of the lights brought them closer to the heart of something dark and unknown. They had stumbled into a part of the ship they didn't recognize, a place untouched by the sterile, metallic corridors they had known. The walls here were different. They were covered with symbols, strange, alien markings that twisted and shifted when Jamie looked at them too long. Some of the symbols seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, beating in time with the strange rhythmic hum that filled the air. They were ancient, too ancient, and something about them felt wrong, as though they had been left behind on purpose, as if they were meant to be forgotten. Natasha's hand brushed against one of the symbols, her fingers trembling, as though drawn to it by an unseen force. The moment her skin made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through her, and she gasped, recoiling as though she had touched something burning. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jamie didn't know. The symbols were familiar, and yet unfamiliar, like echoes of something he should remember but couldn't. His mind felt clouded, fogged by the oppressive atmosphere, and the shadows, those same shifting, slithering shadows that always lurked just out of sight, seemed to be moving in time with the symbols. "It's not the ship," Jamie said, his voice barely more than a hoarse breath. "This isn't the ship, it's something else." But what? They continued to move deeper into the chamber, their footsteps muffled by the thick, oppressive silence. The air grew colder, more biting with every step they took. The walls seemed to constrict, narrowing around them, pressing in with an almost malicious intent. Jamie's pulse quickened, and a sick, gnawing feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. Something was coming. He could feel it. He didn't know how he knew, but it was there, hidden in the shadows that moved along the walls, curling like snakes waiting to strike. They reached a large circular room, its ceiling arched high above them. In the center stood an altar, stone and blackened with age. Around it, the symbols were carved deeper into the floor, more intricate, more menacing. The air in this room felt thick, suffocating, as if it had been sealed off from the rest of the ship for centuries. A low, guttural sound broke the silence. A whisper. No, a murmur, coming from deep within the ship, as though the walls themselves were alive, speaking in a tongue Jamie couldn't understand. But the sound, it wasn't the ship. It was something older, something that had been here long before them. "The Dath," Natasha said suddenly, her voice quiet, reverent. I remember something about the Dath, a species, an ancient race." Jamie turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "The Dath?" he repeated. "What are you talking about?" Natasha's gaze seemed distant, unfocused, as if she were seeing something beyond the room, beyond the ship. The Dath. They were a race of beings that fought against the Astri long ago. They were said to be cursed, wiped out by the Astri. But their curse, it remained. Jamie's heart raced. He had heard the name before, but it was a fleeting thought, a whisper at the edge of his memory. The curse? What curse? Before he could ask, the ground beneath them trembled, and the air grew colder, impossibly so. The sound of scraping metal filled the room, distant at first, but growing closer. The walls, those damn walls, seemed to pulse in time with the noise, the shadows stretching farther as if they were alive. "It's coming," Natasha whispered, her voice strained. "It's here." The shadows moved again, but this time they moved with purpose, with intent. They slithered along the walls, undulating like dark, liquid tendrils, reaching for them, stretching further and further. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, the cold biting into Jamie's skin as if it were freezing his very bones. And then it appeared. A shape. No, multiple shapes. Figures, shifting and contorting in the dark, coming into form, flickering like half-formed phantoms. There were too many of them. They were humanoid, but twisted. Wrong. Their bodies stretched unnaturally long, their limbs bending at impossible angles, their faces were just empty voids. No eyes, no mouths. Just darkness, infinite darkness, a darkness that swallowed all light. The Dath. They never died, Natasha breathed, her voice trembling in horror. They never died. They were cursed, trapped in the ship. Jamie's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. His mind was frozen, his body paralyzed by the sight of the creatures that now filled the room, closing in around them like a living nightmare. One of them, taller, more imposing than the others, stepped forward, its elongated limbs dragging across the ground. It raised its face toward them, though it had no face to speak of. There was only a void, an endless chasm of nothingness where its eyes should have been, and a gaping hole where its mouth should have been. "You have awakened us," the creature whispered, though its voice wasn't human. It was something more ancient, more malevolent. It echoed through the room, resonating in Jamie's chest. "You have broken the seal. Now you will join us." The shadows closed in, and Jamie could feel the air around him tighten, growing thick, suffocating. His heart raced, his body shaking as the Dath circled them, their movements slow but deliberate. "We are the curse," the creature continued. "We are the death that never ends. You cannot escape." Jamie looked to Natasha, but she was no longer the person he had known. Her eyes were wide, empty, staring into the void of the creature before her. She was already lost, already absorbed into its power. The darkness had claimed her, and she had become one with it. "No!" Jamie screamed, but the words were meaningless. The Dath's presence was all-encompassing, and the ship itself seemed to be responding to their call. The walls groaned, the floor shook, and the ship began to feel like it was collapsing around him. "We are Legion," the creature whispered, its voice filling Jamie's mind, burrowing into his thoughts. "And now you will join us. Forever." Jamie stumbled backward, but the shadows followed, their tendrils reaching for him, pulling him into the cold, empty void. His breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how hard he fought, he couldn't escape. The darkness surrounded him, consumed him, and the last thing he heard was the low, guttural laughter of the Dath as they closed in. "You cannot escape," they whispered again, the words lingering in the cold, suffocating air. "You are ours." End of Chapter 5. The Dath's Curse. This chapter delves deeper into the mystery of the Dath, an ancient and cursed race that was once trapped aboard the ship, now hunting Jamie and Natasha as they uncover more about the ship's dark history. The oppressive atmosphere builds as the shadows take on a more active role in the story, amplifying the sense of dread and inevitability. The curse of the Dath, their twisted forms, and the ship's growing malevolence set the stage for an even darker descent into terror. Chapter 6. The Heart of the Ship. The deeper they went, the more the ship seemed to devour them. The walls closed in, the air grew colder, and the suffocating weight of the darkness pressed against them from all sides. It was as though the ship was no longer just a machine. No, it was alive. It had become something organic, something sentient. Every turn they took led them deeper into its twisted labyrinth, every step pulling them further into the maw of something ancient and hungry. Jamie's breaths came shallow, his chest tight as if the air itself was thickening with every passing second. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that was always just out of sight, lurking in the corners of his vision. Every shadow in the hall seemed to stretch further than it should, its edges curling and twisting as though the darkness itself was alive. The ship had become a living thing, and they were its prey. "Jamie, do you feel it?" Natasha's voice was barely a whisper, but the tremor in her words was unmistakable. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing the metal wall, as though trying to ground herself in the familiar. But the ship was anything but familiar now. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that twisted and shifted, as if they had a life of their own. They seemed to pulse, glowing faintly with a sickly light, like veins beneath the skin of some monstrous living creature. Jamie didn't need to answer. He could feel it too. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was something more, a body, a mind, a force that had been waiting for them. The very air was charged with malevolent energy, humming with an unnatural power that seemed to vibrate deep in his bones. It was as if the ship had sensed their presence and was drawing them closer to its center, to its heart, where its true power resided. But the deeper they went, the harder it became to stay focused. The walls seemed to twist and bend around them, like a maze that changed with every step. The ship was toying with them, playing a game with no rules, a game where they were nothing more than prey. The shadows moved with them, stretching and contorting, always just a little too close, always just a little too real. "We can't stop," Jamie muttered, but his voice felt hollow in his ears. "We have to keep going. We have to find a way out." Natasha didn't answer. She couldn't. The fear had taken root in her, and he could see it in her eyes. The glazed, distant look of someone who had already begun to surrender. She was slipping, losing herself to the ship, to whatever dark force had awakened within its walls. They rounded a corner, and suddenly the air grew even colder, the chill biting into their skin. The lights above them flickered once, then twice, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor, crawling like living things. Jamie's breath came in short, sharp gasps, his chest tightening with every inhale. The walls felt like they were closing in, the darkness pressing down on them from every angle. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the coldness disappeared. The ship seemed to exhale, and the air felt heavy with an oppressive presence. It was as though the ship itself had stopped breathing, waiting, listening. "Jamie!" Natasha's voice broke the silence, her voice raw with fear. "I think it's here, the heart of the ship. I can feel it." She was right. Jamie could feel it too. A heavy, malevolent force that pulsed beneath their feet, beneath the very skin of the ship. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was something more, something ancient. The walls seemed to hum with a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm, like a heartbeat coming from deep within the ship. It was alive, and it was aware of them. They reached a large door, its surface covered in the same twisted symbols that adorned the walls. It was the only way forward, and Jamie didn't hesitate. His hand gripped the cold metallic handle, and with a hard push, the door groaned open, revealing the chamber beyond. It was like stepping into the belly of the beast. The room was vast, larger than any space they had encountered before, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The floor was slick with some oily substance, and the air was thick with the smell of decay, of something ancient and dead. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the shadows here were deeper, more solid, as though they were not just shadows at all, but something else, something that existed beyond the veil of reality. In the center of the room stood an altar, made of stone and blackened with age. Around it, the symbols were carved deeper into the floor, etched into the very bones of the ship. The air was thick with the presence of something long forgotten, something that had been sealed away for eternity. The room seemed to breathe, the walls shifting ever so slightly, as if the ship itself was alive, and its heart was beating with an unstoppable force. Jamie stepped forward, his feet slipping on the oily floor, his body trembling. He could feel the weight of the ship's gaze upon him, the oppressive presence closing in on him, smothering him. He reached out, his hand hovering above the altar, drawn to it as if it were calling him, as though the ship's heart was pulling him in. It was too much to resist. "Jamie." Natasha's voice was faint, but he could hear the desperation in her tone. "Don't touch it, please." But Jamie couldn't stop himself. His hand lowered, brushing against the stone. The moment his fingers made contact, the air around them seemed to crackle with energy, a surge of power that slammed into him like a tidal wave. He staggered backward, but it was too late. The darkness exploded outward, filling the room with a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the ship. The shadows erupted, coiling and writhing, swirling around Jamie and Natasha like a living storm. The walls groaned, the floor cracked beneath their feet, and the altar itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its symbols glowing with an eerie light. It was alive, and it was awakening. "You have freed me." The voice came from everywhere, from the walls, the air, from the altar itself. It was deep, impossibly ancient, a voice that felt as though it had been buried for millennia, only to be woken by their trespass. "You have awakened the curse. You have brought it back." Jamie's heart slammed against his ribs, panic surging through him. The shadows pressed in, suffocating, crawling into his lungs, his skin. The presence of the ship, of whatever ancient force resided within it, was overwhelming. It was in his mind, in his body, in his very soul. The altar began to tremble and the shadows shifted again, forming into shapes, human-like, but not quite. Their bodies were elongated, their skin mottled and stretched, their eyes hollow voids of darkness. They reached for Jamie, their fingers long and gnarled, their mouths stretched open, their teeth sharp and jagged. "You are mine now," the voice purred, its tone heavy with satisfaction. "You will never leave. You will become part of the ship, part of the curse." Jamie turned to Natasha, but she was no longer the woman he had known. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her face blank, her body stiff as though she were caught in some kind of trance. She had already been claimed. The shadows reached for him, their fingers curling around his arms, dragging him toward the altar. He screamed, but no sound came out. The ship was devouring him, pulling him into its heart, into the abyss where nothing could escape. "Welcome home," the voice whispered as everything went black. End of Chapter 6. The Heart of the Ship. In this expanded version of Chapter 6, the presence of the ship's malevolent core intensifies, with Jamie and Natasha encountering the heart of the ship, a place where the darkness that drives the ship's twisted existence is concentrated. The presence of the Darth's curse becomes undeniable, as the shadows seem to take on life and pull Jamie and Natasha deeper into the ship's all-consuming darkness. The chapter builds a sense of inevitability as the ship's power is awakened and begins to consume them both. Chapter 7. The Darth's Curse. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating, relentless, like a living thing that surrounded them. Every breath Jamie took felt thick, as though the very air was laced with fear, heavy with the echoes of ancient horrors. The walls of the ship had become alive, writhing with unseen malevolent energy. The presence they had encountered in the heart of the ship's true corrupted consciousness, now clung to them, like a parasite burrowing into their minds, twisting their very thoughts. Jamie could feel the presence of the Darth, the cursed race, like a cold breath at the back of his neck. The ship, its heart, had awakened something far older, far darker. They were no longer just intruders in this mechanical labyrinth. They were prey, hunted by something that had once been a race of beings, twisted by a curse, their very souls consumed by the darkness that had taken root in the ship. The Darth were not just ghosts, they were something far worse. They were trapped in this place, bound to its unholy heart, driven by hunger and torment that had lasted for centuries. Jamie glanced at Natasha, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, though she had not spoken since they had entered the heart of the ship. Her body seemed frozen, as though she too had been claimed by the curse, consumed by the ship's power. It had taken her. He could feel it, the subtle change in her. She wasn't the same woman she had been when they first entered this hellish place. The curse had marked her, just as it had marked the ship, and now she was drifting away, lost in the shadows that clung to her skin like an insidious infection. "Natasha," Jamie whispered, his voice hoarse with desperation, but it was as if she couldn't hear him. Her gaze fixed on something far beyond him, something unreachable. She was slipping away, becoming part of the ship, part of the curse. They had ventured deeper into the belly of the beast, past the altar where the Darth had once been worshipped, past the heart of the ship, where its power thrummed like a living organ. They were no longer in control of their own movements. The ship had taken over, guiding them deeper, deeper into its blackened core, where the very fabric of reality seemed to bend and stretch, where time and space no longer followed the rules they had once known. Jamie's footsteps were slow, heavy, as though the ship itself were pulling him down, anchoring him to the place of its birth. The corridor stretched before them like an endless tunnel, the walls slick with moisture, the air thick with the smell of decay. The walls, once smooth and metallic, now pulsed with an unnatural life. The symbols, those dark, writhing symbols, had grown larger, more intricate, their twisted forms crawling across the surfaces of the ship like sentient things. Every step Jamie took felt like a step deeper into the bowels of some terrible creature, a place where nothing human could survive. "Jamie!" Natasha's voice broke through the thick fog of fear and confusion that clung to him. Her voice was distant, disconnected, as though she were speaking from far away. I see them." He turned to her, his heart racing, but her eyes were empty, staring into the distance as if she were lost in a nightmare. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The Darth," she whispered, her voice barely audible like a prayer. "They're here. They never left." Jamie's blood ran cold. The Darth, their curse, their torment, it was real. They hadn't just been a legend, a whisper lost to time. They were here, in the heart of the ship, bound by the curse that had twisted them into something monstrous. They were not dead. They were trapped, trapped in the ship, in its heart, and the ship had never forgotten them. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening, pressing in on them like a tide. Jamie could feel the temperature drop, feel the chill crawl into his bones, like something creeping beneath his skin. He could hear it now, whispers, low and guttural, coming from the walls. No, not from the walls, from inside his mind. "You are not alone," the voice murmured, its tone deep and resonant, as if it were coming from the depths of a forgotten cavern. "We are the Darth. We are your torment." Jamie stumbled back, his heart pounding. The voice, no, the presence, it was everywhere, inside the walls, inside his mind. The shadows grew longer, their forms shifting, coalescing into shapes that were too grotesque to be real. The Darth were here. They were not just haunting the ship, they had become the ship. They had fused with it, their torment woven into its very fabric. "You have awakened us," the voice continued, louder now, resonating through the ship like the rumble of thunder. "We were lost to time, but you have freed us. You have brought us back. And now," the voice grew darker, more insistent, "now you will join us. You will become one with us, forever." The ship trembled again, a violent shudder that sent a jolt through Jamie's spine. The walls cracked, the sound like bones snapping, and a cold wind howled down the corridor, carrying with it the scent of death, of rot, of something long dead. The Darth were awakening. They were rising from the depths, from the dark places where they had been trapped. And they were hungry. The shadows stretched out toward them, their forms becoming more distinct, more corporeal. There were shapes now, humanoid, but not quite human. Their bodies were twisted, their limbs elongated, their skin grey and mottled, stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes were empty voids, black holes that seemed to suck in the light around them. Their mouths opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth, sharp and cruel. Jamie's stomach churned. The Darth were no longer the ancient, fallen race they had once been. They were something worse now, something worse than death. They had become monsters, creatures of the void, slaves to the curse that had consumed them, and they were coming for him. The shadows reached out, their fingers long and gnarled, their claws scraping against the floor like knives. Jamie tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs were frozen in place, his feet stuck to the floor as if the ship had gripped him in its iron grasp. Natasha was beside him, but she wasn't herself anymore. She had already been claimed by the Darth. She was one of them now. Her body was still intact, but her soul, her mind, had been consumed by the ship, by the curse. "No," Jamie whispered, his voice hoarse, raw with panic. He struggled against the invisible force that held him in place, but it was useless. The Darth were too close now. They were everywhere. Their voices, their whispers, filled the air, crawling under his skin, into his mind. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices a chorus of dread. "Become one with us. Become one with the ship." Jamie screamed, but no sound escaped his mouth. The ship had swallowed him whole. The death had claimed him. The shadows closed in, their fingers curling around his arms, dragging him toward the center of the darkness, toward the heart of the ship where the curse had begun. There was no escape. There was no way out. The last thing Jamie saw before the darkness claimed him was Natasha's face, her eyes empty and vacant, staring into nothing, lost to the curse. She was already gone. And now, he would be too. End of Chapter 7. The Dath's Curse. In this extended chapter, the terror escalates as Jamie and Natasha are drawn further into the ship's heart, and the Dath's curse becomes an inescapable nightmare. The twisted presence of the Dath, along with their hunger and torment, permeates the very essence of the ship, leaving the characters trapped in a dark, suffocating world that consumes everything. The shadows, the whispers, and the creeping dread leave the reader feeling that escape is impossible, as the ship, alive with a malevolent consciousness, has claimed them all. Chapter 8. The Betrayal. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against Jamie's chest like a weight, suffocating him, making it hard to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the ship was alive, waiting, watching. Every creak of the metal, every flicker of the lights overhead, sent a chill through him. It was as though the very air was charged with something malignant, something ancient that had awoken deep within the ship's bones. The darkness that had once seemed like a distant threat was now all-encompassing, closing in on them from all sides. Jamie turned to Natasha, his eyes narrowing in concern. She had been acting strange for hours, her movements jerky, her eyes wide and unfocused. She had barely spoken since they had entered the heart of the ship, and now there was something even more unsettling in her demeanor. She was staring at the walls, her hand trembling at her side, but her gaze was vacant, distant, almost as if she wasn't really there. "Natasha." Jamie's voice was strained, weak, as though he were trying to reach through a fog. "Talk to me." But she didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand and traced one of the symbols etched into the wall, her fingers brushing lightly against the dark, pulsing lines. Her lips moved in a whisper, but the words were unintelligible. An ancient language, a curse buried deep within the ship's corrupted heart. Jamie's pulse quickened as he stepped closer, trying to reach her, trying to snap her out of whatever trance she had fallen into. But there was something wrong. There was a coldness to her now, a detachment that he couldn't explain. It was as though the ship had already taken her, as though she was no longer the person he had known. "Stop!" Jamie shouted, grabbing her arm and jerking her away from the wall. "You have to listen to me. You're not thinking straight." Natasha's eyes snapped to him then, cold, empty, distant. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Her face remained blank, expressionless, as she stared at him without saying a word. Then, without warning, she twisted her arm out of his grasp, a sharp, unnerving smile curling across her lips. "It's too late, Jamie," she whispered, her voice low and hollow. "I've already made my choice." Jamie recoiled, his heart slamming against his ribs. The words cut into him like a blade. He could feel the ship's oppressive presence growing stronger, heavier, as though it was feeding off their fear, manipulating them like puppets in a twisted game. Natasha, his partner, his ally, was no longer the person he had trusted. She had been consumed, just like the others, lost to the curse of the Darth, the curse that had been buried in the ship's very foundation. "What are you talking about?" Jamie's voice cracked, desperation rising within him. "You don't have to do this. We can still get out of here. We can fight this." but Natasha only shook her head slowly, almost as if pitying him. The coldness in her eyes deepened, and Jamie could feel the growing distance between them. She was slipping away, and he couldn't stop it. "You don't understand, Jamie," she said softly, her voice almost gentle. "You can't fight the ship. You can't fight the Darth. They've already claimed me. I'm part of them now. I'm part of the ship." Her words felt like a death sentence, a sharp final blow to everything Jamie had fought for. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The ship had already consumed her. It had twisted her, turned her against him, and now it was too late. "No!" Jamie shouted, his voice hoarse, filled with agony. He stepped back, his body trembling. "I won't let it take you. You're still in there, Natasha. I know you are. Fight it. Fight it for me." But Natasha simply smiled again, that same cold, empty smile that made his stomach turn. "It's too late, Jamie," she repeated, her voice firm now, as if she had accepted some terrible truth. "The ship has already claimed me, and there's nothing you can do to change that." The shadows seemed to shift around her then, closing in, wrapping themselves around her body like tendrils, as though they were acknowledging her words, responding to the ship's call. Jamie watched, helpless, as the shadows grew darker, more intense, pulling her deeper into their embrace. The curse of the Dath had consumed her. It had turned her into something else, something he couldn't recognize. And then, with a sudden, sickening twist, Natasha lunged at him. Her movements were unnaturally fast, too fast, like she wasn't fully in control of herself anymore. Her hand shot out, her fingers curling around his throat with a strength that was not her own, her grip tightening like a vice. Jamie gasped, struggling for breath as the pressure around his neck increased. His vision blurred at the edges, the darkness closing in as he fought to break free. The terror that filled him was not just from the physical attack. It was from the realization that Natasha was no longer the person he had known. She was something else now. She was part of the ship, part of the curse, and the ship had chosen her. "I told you, Jamie," she whispered through gritted teeth, her voice cold and detached. "You can't fight it. You can't fight me." With every breath, Jamie felt his strength leaving him, the blackness closing in around him, his thoughts slipping away as the world around him seemed to spin. Natasha's eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, bore into him, her expression blank as if she were lost in a trance, caught between the curse and the ship. She had betrayed him, but it wasn't her fault. The ship had claimed her. In a final, desperate attempt, Jamie reached for the pulse gun at his side, his hand shaking as he pulled it free. His vision was clouding, his movements slow and sluggish, but somehow he managed to raise the gun and fire it point blank at her. The blast hit her in the chest, sending her stumbling backward, her grip loosening around his throat. She collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud, her body twitching as if she were convulsing, writhing in agony. But even as she fell, the shadows around her began to pulse, swirling with an unnatural energy, as though the ship itself was reacting to the violence, to the attack on its own. The walls seemed to groan, and Jamie could feel the ship's malevolent consciousness stirring, angry, vengeful. Natasha lay on the floor, motionless now, her body twisted in unnatural angles. The shadows continued to swirl around her, but there was no movement, no life left in her eyes. "You have made a grave mistake." The voice of the ship rumbled through the air, its tone deep and resonant, like the growl of some ancient beast waking from slumber. "You have angered me." The temperature in the room dropped, plummeting to unbearable cold. Jamie shivered violently as the shadows around him thickened, the air growing dense with the ship's wrath. He had betrayed the ship's will, and now he would pay the price. He tried to stand, tried to move, but the ship had already begun to take hold of him. He felt the shadows reach for him, wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. It was too late. The ship was closing in. "You have failed, Jamie Wallace," the voice continued, the tone final, unyielding. "You will never escape." With a final, brutal yank, the shadows dragged him backward, toward the altar, toward the heart of the ship. And as Jamie struggled, his thoughts clouded with terror, with the sickening realization that he had lost everything. The ship's cold embrace swallowed him whole. End of Chapter 8. The Betrayal. In this chapter, the sense of betrayal is amplified as Natasha succumbs to the ship's curse, turning against Jamie in a horrifying and unexpected twist. The ship, now fully aware of Jamie's defiance, reacts with vengeance, showing just how deeply the malevolent force has taken root. The shadows, the ship's consciousness, and the Darth's curse are now fully entwined, and Jamie's desperate attempts to escape grow increasingly futile as the darkness pulls him back into its embrace. Chapter 9. The Final Stand. The cold had never felt so suffocating. Jamie stumbled forward, each step a struggle against the invisible weight that pressed against him from all sides. His breath was shallow, fogging in the air as if the very atmosphere around him was trying to choke him, to rob him of his last breath. The walls of the ship seemed to close in, the corridors narrowing like a maze that twisted tighter with every turn, every step. The pulse of the ship's heart thudded beneath his feet, reverberating through his bones. It was rhythmic, but it wasn't a heartbeat. It was something more sinister, something ancient, an echo of something that had lived and died countless times over. The ship itself was a creature, its heartbeat a reminder that it was alive, and that it had never been more awake than it was now. The dark presence inside its core had stirred, and it was watching Jamie now, following his every movement with a slow, predatory awareness. The ship had become a prison, a tomb of endless corridors and ever-tightening shadows. The walls pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as if the ship itself were breathing, its deep exhale soaking up the remnants of light in the room. The air was thick with despair, with the pungent stench of decay that seemed to cling to every surface, every inch of space. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered, its tones thick with ancient malice. "You are mine." Jamie could feel it now. The voice was no longer distant, a whisper at the back of his mind. No, it was real. It was inside him, clawing its way into his thoughts, consuming his every breath. The ship's consciousness, once a mere presence, now felt like a living thing, wrapped around his very soul, its dark fingers clutching his heart. The Darth, the cursed race that had once been trapped within the ship's heart, were no longer ghosts, no longer just figments of his imagination. They were real, and they were coming for him. He could feel them in the walls, their dark forms stretching through the ship like liquid shadows. Their whispers echoed in the metal veins of the ship, filling the air with their hunger, their torment. "We are the curse," the voice murmured, distant but insistent. "You cannot break us. You cannot escape us." Jamie's legs trembled, the floor slick beneath him, and he could feel his breath growing heavier, more erratic with each passing second. The darkness seemed to curl in on him, pressing down from all sides. He reached out, his hands brushing the walls as he tried to steady himself, but the ship's very structure felt wrong now, slick, shifting, alive. It was moving. It was alive. "I won't be your prey." The words came out as a whisper, but the defiance behind them was all he had left. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on to that, onto himself. The presence of the ship, the curse, was pulling at him, slowly eroding everything that was left. But he had to fight. He had to resist. The shadows shifted again, elongating, stretching toward him like dark, grasping fingers. A low hiss echoed through the hallway, coming from all directions, from the walls, from the air itself. "You are not in control here," the voice purred, its tone sweet, seductive, a voice that promised nothing but despair. "You will never leave. You will never escape." Jamie staggered forward, fighting the overwhelming sensation of dread that threatened to pull him under. The ship was collapsing in on him. His own heartbeat sounded too loud in his ears, drowned out only by the horrific whispers that filled the space around him. Every part of him was screaming to run, but there was no escape. There was no way out. Every direction seemed to lead deeper into the ship's twisted core, and each new corridor he passed seemed like another tightening noose. And then he saw it. At the end of the hallway, where the darkness gathered like a living thing, stood a figure. It was not human. It could never be human. The figure was tall, impossibly so, its limbs elongated, its form shifting in unnatural angles. Its face, or what might have once been a face, was a blur of darkness, a void that sucked in all light, an emptiness that seemed to swallow the very air around it. It was not one of the Dath. No, this creature was something else entirely, something more ancient, more terrifying. The figure moved toward him with a slow, deliberate pace, its limbs extending and retracting like tendrils, as though the very air around it was bending to its will. The shadows seemed to ripple around it, bending and shifting in ways that defied nature, like liquid darkness spilling over the floor. "You cannot win, Jamie Wallace," the voice echoed, both in his mind and from the figure's impossible mouth. It was everywhere. It was inside him, inside the ship. "You are mine now. The Dath are not the only ones who are trapped here. You too will join us. Forever." Jamie's pulse spiked, his heart hammering in his chest as he tried to force his legs to move, to escape. But the weight of the darkness around him seemed to keep him rooted in place. His body refused to obey. The figure was getting closer, its form growing clearer, more solid. Its eyes, no, its sockets, were hollow, deep voids that seemed to reach into his very soul, pulling him in, drowning him. He had to move. He couldn't let it take him. He wouldn't. "No!" Jamie gasped, his voice breaking, his body trembling under the weight of the ship's power. The very air around him seemed to crush him, to bend his mind, until all he could think about was escaping, breaking free of the pull that the ship had on him. He reached for the pulse gun at his side, his fingers trembling as they grasped the weapon. But the shadows, those horrible shadows, moved faster than he could react. They reached out for him, coiling around his arms, pulling him back, dragging him toward the figure, toward the heart of the ship, toward his doom. "You cannot escape." The voice was louder now, a roar that filled the space, vibrating through his very bones. "I am the ship. I am everything. You are nothing." With one last surge of willpower, Jamie fired. The shot hit the figure square in the chest, and for a brief moment, the creature faltered, its form flickering like a broken image. But the blast did nothing. The figure did not fall. It did not even flinch. It merely stood there, staring at him, its hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The shadows around him intensified, wrapping tighter around his body. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. He was losing. He was failing. The creature had already won. But then the ship shook. It was a violent tremor, a deafening quake that rattled the walls, shaking the very foundation of the vessel. Jamie's body was thrown forward, his feet slipping on the slick floor as the ship itself seemed to fight against the force that had taken hold of it. The shadows recoiled, pulling away from him, retreating into the corners of the room. The figure staggered, its form flickering again, becoming less solid, more translucent. "What is this?" the voice hissed, its tone suddenly uncertain, filled with a strange desperation. "No, you cannot break free." Jamie could feel the change. The pulse of the ship, the very heartbeat of its consciousness, was faltering. It was as if something inside the ship had broken, had snapped. The ship itself was struggling against whatever force had taken hold of it. It was fighting, losing its hold over him. With one final desperate push, Jamie reached for the altar. He had no choice now. He could feel the ship's heart, its power, surging, threatening to consume everything. But he couldn't stop. He had to finish it. "This is the end." The voice was a growl now, low and filled with fury. "You will die here, Jamie Wallace. You will never leave." But Jamie didn't listen. He couldn't. He had to destroy it. He had to destroy the heart. With everything he had left, he slammed his hand down on the altar. The explosion of light and power that followed felt like an earthquake, a shockwave that rippled through every fiber of the ship's being. The darkness around him shrieked in fury, the ship itself howling as its power, the very core of its existence, was torn apart. And then, everything went silent. End of Chapter 9. The Final Stand. In this expanded version of Chapter 9, the overwhelming force of the ship's malevolent presence intensifies, with Jamie fighting desperately against the curse of the Dath and the ship's overwhelming power. The chapter builds up to a final confrontation between Jamie and the dark force that has consumed Natasha and the ship, leading to a temporary victory as Jamie fights back with everything he has left. Yet, despite this brief moment of hope, the ship's true nature still looms large. leaving Jamie with the terrifying realization that escape may not be possible. Chapter 10. Echoes in the darkness. The silence after the explosion was absolute, suffocating. The ship had fallen still, as if the last breath of life had been drawn from its twisted form. Jamie's heart pounded in his ears, each beat ringing like a bell, louder and louder until it felt like his skull might burst from the pressure. He stood in the center of the now empty chamber, his legs weak, his body trembling with exhaustion, his mind still reeling from the explosion that had torn through the ship's core. The shadows that had once surrounded him, pressing in from every direction, had receded, flickered and vanished like smoke in the wind. The walls, too, had ceased their pulsing rhythm. The ship's heartbeat had stopped, leaving only a cold, eerie quiet in its place. The oppressive weight that had hung over him for so long, like a heavy curtain of darkness, was gone. And yet, despite the sudden stillness, Jamie felt an unease creeping through him, slithering beneath his skin. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. He tried to shake the thoughts away, to focus, to make sense of the chaos. Natasha's body lay motionless on the floor before him, her expression vacant, as if her spirit had long since left her. The pulse gun had been discarded beside her, an abandoned weapon in the face of the inevitable. The ship had consumed her, just as it had consumed so many before them. The curse of the death was insidious, wrapping around them like a noose, squeezing the very life out of them. But Jamie couldn't let that happen. Not yet. Not while there was still a flicker of hope. He wasn't going to be another victim. He wasn't going to let the ship claim him too. His feet moved on their own accord, carrying him away from the altar, away from the epicenter of the ship's power. He stumbled through the darkened corridors, his mind still foggy, his body aching, but he pressed on, desperation fueling his every step. The ship had stopped pulsing, but Jamie could feel its presence still lurking beneath the surface, waiting. The halls were silent now, too silent. The oppressive quiet was worse than the sounds of the ship's heartbeat, worse than the whispering shadows. At least then, Jamie had known where the threat was coming from. But now everything felt wrong. The silence was unnatural. It was suffocating. Jamie reached for his comm unit, his hand shaking as he activated it. The static buzzed in his ear, the only sound breaking the stillness. There was no response. The system was down. No help was coming. His chest tightened. He had expected this. No one had been able to reach them from the outside. The ship had been cut off from communication long before he and Natasha had arrived. It had isolated them, trapped them in this nightmare with no way out. He was alone, utterly, completely alone. Suddenly, the ship seemed to groan. A low, reverberating sound that crawled through the walls, vibrating in the air. Jamie froze in place, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't the normal creaking of the ship's metal bones. No, this was something else, something deeper, something that resonated in his chest, like a vibration from the very heart of the ship. It was coming from below. The floor beneath Jamie's feet shifted with a groan, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the halls, like the growl of some ancient, slumbering beast waking from a long, dark sleep. The entire ship seemed to tremble with the force, and for a moment Jamie thought the walls would collapse, that the very structure of the ship would crumble around him. But it didn't. The tremor stopped, leaving a sickening silence in its wake. Jamie swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, but there was nowhere left to hide. The ship had become a labyrinth, twisting in on itself, an endless maze with no way out. He had no choice but to follow the sound, to go deeper into the ship, into the heart of the darkness that had swallowed Natasha whole. He moved cautiously, his feet silent against the cold metal floor. His eyes darted around, watching for any movement, any sign of life or death. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer, more pronounced, like they were following him, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The corridor ahead seemed to split into two. One path was dark, impenetrable, swallowed by shadows. The other was lit by a faint, flickering light that seemed to pulse in time with the rhythmic hum that still thrummed through the ship. It was coming from deeper within the ship's core, the heart of the beast, the center of its power. Jamie didn't hesitate. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening, what had happened to Natasha, to the ship. He chose the path with the faint light, each step a slow, deliberate push against the dread that clung to his body like cold sweat. The air grew colder as he ventured deeper. The flickering light above him danced in strange patterns, casting twisted, disjointed shadows across the walls. He could feel the pressure building, like the walls were closing in on him, like the ship was tightening its grip. Then it came again, the voice, the whispering, echoing, filling the space around him. You should not have come back. The voice was faint at first, distant, but it grew louder, clearer, until it was inside his head, clawing at his thoughts. You cannot undo what has been done. The words sent a shiver down his spine, and for a moment Jamie thought he might collapse. The shadows reached out, coiling around his feet like serpents, pulling him into the darkness. The ship wasn't just alive, it was conscious, and it knew he was here. You are mine, the voice hissed, and the walls seemed to close in even tighter, the air suffocating. You will never escape. Jamie stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his mind spiraling into chaos. He couldn't see the shadows, couldn't feel them physically, but he knew they were there, surrounding him, closing in from all sides. The ship's consciousness was bearing down on him, smothering him, dragging him into its abyss. He reached for the pulse gun at his side, his fingers trembling as he gripped it. But before he could raise it, the shadows surged forward, tightening around him, forcing him to his knees. You belong to me, the voice whispered again, and Jamie could feel it, feel the pull, the cold embrace of the ship's power reaching into his soul. It was consuming him, drowning him in its malevolent force. But even as the darkness closed in, Jamie's eyes locked onto the light at the end of the corridor. The faint glow was still there, flickering, beckoning him forward. It was the only thing left, the only thing that hadn't been swallowed by the darkness. With a final, desperate effort, Jamie pushed against the shadows that clung to him, his hands shaking as he reached for the light. He could feel the pull of the darkness, its cold, insidious grasp, dragging him back. But he fought against it, his fingers brushing the edge of the light. And then, suddenly the shadows recoiled. For the briefest moment, everything went still. The air shifted. The pulse of the ship's heart slowed, faltering. The walls groaned in protest, like the ship was in agony, struggling against something, struggling against him. The darkness around him began to recede, and with it, the voice faded, its whispers dying out like a far-off scream in the distance. Jamie gasped for breath, his hands shaking as he pressed against the floor to steady himself. The ship's power was receding, its grip loosening, but he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Not until he destroyed the source, the heart of the curse. With a roar, Jamie forced himself to his feet, his legs weak, his body battered, but driven by a single desperate need to end this nightmare. The flickering light was still there, just ahead, and in that light, he could see the altar, the source of the ship's malevolent power, the heart of the Dath's curse. He took a step forward, then another. Each step was a fight, but he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not when the end was so close. This ends now, Jamie muttered, the words barely a whisper as he raised his gun toward the altar, his body trembling with the force of everything he had left. He would end it.